there. Can you hear me now? There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I was like, you're clapping. I haven't said anything yet. The state of my ego. Welcome. My name is Eliza Nyangwe. I am the managing editor of CNN as Equals. CNN as Equals is a global gender inequality reporting team with a team that is across different parts of the world. What we say is that we do not report on women, but we report on patriarchy and try and cover the systemic issues that underpin the inequality between the genders. The reason I am here and taking up time from this precious panel is that As Equals is facilitating a new project, a collaborative project called The Gender Beat, which is trying to do several things that will be covered in the panel. And it is from CNN's perspective, an important way for us to collaborate with other organizations, with other individuals in different parts of the world, especially when sometimes collaborating over stories is difficult, right? Can we facilitate community instead and facilitate knowledge sharing and best practice sharing? And so this panel and the work of the Gender Beat, which I'm sure you will hear more about, is really encouraging that. Before I hand over to Megan, who's chairing the session, I just wanted to leave you with chilling thought. An Ipsos Mori survey, I think I heard it, another of the speakers on this panel shared it from March of this year to coincide with International Women's Day, found that over half of the respondents think that gender equality has gone far enough. I hope I represented that data well. Yes. Yeah. Please do. It shows that we are working together. For me, this is just such a really chilling idea that despite the amount of gender journalism that we have, despite the work that remains to be important to be done, people think that gender equality has gone far enough. And I'm hoping that the work that you will hear talked about today will show why a project like the Gender Beat is not just important, but also urgent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Eliza, and welcome everyone to our panel, The State of Gender Journalism Around the World, Challenges, Approaches and Opportunities. I don't know if this is just the sort of British side of me, but every time I read this panel title, I'm like, the state of it. Look at the state of gender journalism, but that is not going to be the theme of this session, and I know that all of our panelists do have some positive things to share about the amazing work that's being done on gender around the world. Just briefly to introduce myself, my name is Megan Clement. I am the editor of the Impact newsletter. Impact is a weekly newsletter of feminist journalism that we send out in English et en français, si vous voulez, every week, and you are all encouraged to sign up, impact.substack.com. I am joined today, I'm also, I should mention, Eliza's colleague at the Gender Beat, a member of that collective, along with the wonderful person to my left, who is Ankita Anand. She is another member of our team. She is also an editor and head of partnerships with Unbiased the News and a cross-border journalist. We also have with us Agustina Ordoqui, who is a journalist based in Buenos Aires, who specializes in gender and human rights, and she is also an extremely valued contributor to the Impact newsletter. And then at the end here, someone who I can't really see, but I trust that she is there. Hello, Luba. We have Luba Kassova, a researcher, journalist, and director at the international audience strategy consultancy ACAS? ACAS. She is the author of the award-winning three-part series of Missing Perspective of Women in News, including the latest solutions-focused report titled From Outrage to Opportunity, which was launched at the end of last year. Luba has done some truly groundbreaking work in this area, and I'm so happy that she's here with us today. I wanted to explain a little bit more about some of the findings we're going to be talking about today. So the Gender Beat got together at the end of last year to try and really build a collaborative project that is set up to showcase the best of gender journalism, and another panel in this stream of events really shared some of that yesterday, and build community for gender journalists and editors with a focus on the majority world, and also catalyze a change in how the media industry perceives gender journalism. So we're really, if I can use a slightly French word, we're trying to valorize this form of journalism. It can be very lonely work, reporting on feminist issues, and the community that we have already joined us in this mission is really inspiring. This is our QR code. Please give it a go. Why don't you stick your phones in the air like you're at a rock concert? Scan our Rockin' Dinosaur QR code, and you will see more information about the Gender Beat there. One of the things you will see at that link is a survey. So what was really important to us when we started conceiving of this project was to find out who was out there doing this work, who is covering gender topics, who is covering feminist movements, who is digging deep into gender inequality worldwide and doing this very important reporting. So my colleague Ankita is going to talk a little bit more about that, but we have surveyed nearly 95 gender journalists worldwide so far, and we're going to present some of the preliminary findings we have from that survey of people's experiences doing this type of journalism. I would like to say that at this QR code there is a link to fill out the survey, and the survey is still open, and if we went over 100 while at this festival, I would go back to Paris a very happy woman. So please do take time to fill out the survey. I should mention it's not just for reporters and editors, it is for audience developers, community managers, NGO workers, activists, academics, funders. We need more funders. Any funders in the room? Be brave, fill out my survey. It's anonymous. But before we get into the results of our data, I really wanted Luba to share some of her insights from her research with us. Her 3 reports are amazing. Her most recent one, From Outrage to Opportunity, has really catalyzed fascinating discussions in our sector about women in media, women in news, intersectionality, all of it. I'm not going to talk over her anymore. I'm just going to ask her a very quick question. It's sort of based on a personal reflection of mine, because I was here at the International Journalism Festival in 2018, and this was post-Me Too, a movement that was not started by reporting in the New York Times, a movement that was started by Tarana Burke, but a movement that was picked up following the revelations of journalists at the New York Times. And really, at the festival at that time, the rooms were really buzzing with energy about how to cover gender better, and it was very exciting as someone who focuses on this. What I have perhaps noticed since then is less of a buzz. So I wanted Luba to tell us, based on her research, how has reporting about gender sort of changed since 2017, according to what you found?
Thank you, Megan, and thank you for your generous introduction. I'm very kind. You're absolutely right in your instinct to have noticed that there's been, the buzz has really declined since 2018. What the research we've done shows is that, in fact, 2018 was a peak year in terms of coverage of sexual violence, issues that are relevant to women, such as sexual violence, childbearing, childcare, reproductive health, gender-based discrimination, and gender equality. But even though the coverage peaked at 2018, it was only 2.5% of all online global coverage. So perhaps the most significant point to make today is that it is really marginal coverage, and this year it has gone down from 2.5 to 2.1% of all online coverage. To give you some reference, the business coverage is 24% of all global coverage, and politics is 19%. So you can understand the relativity and how undercovered really the issues are that are very, very important. Now, that happens for many, many reasons, but some of them is because when you mention gender angles or gender stories, the misperception is that they're soft news, or that those angles are ignored, or in many cases, journalists really simply don't have the skills to identify the right angles within the stories. The decline in coverage is a result of three key, I think, barriers that have surfaced since 2018. Firstly, as Megan alluded to, the movement that was reignited in 2018 has since then lost the interest among the journalist community. Secondly, during the pandemic, women's voices were crowded out and silenced along the whole news value chain, and I can go more into that if you want later on in Q&A. And finally, to reference back to what Eliza said, there is a real backlash or resistance towards gender equality globally, and that's really worrying. So 6 in 10, as Eliza said, of people think that too many men ask to do too much to support gender equality. In the UK, the number in 2019 was, the percentage was 27% in 2019, and now it's 43%. So in 3 years, we're seeing really strong resistance, which makes the job of gender journalists that much harder. And I really feel for you. First of all, there is obviously need to report on these issues because there is not enough coverage, and secondly, there is pushback. And news, unfortunately, is not as progressive as we think. It's largely a reflection of our society rather than a progressive force that drives society forward. Certainly, that's what's bad in terms of the numbers that we're seeing in the analysis that we're doing.
Thank you so much, Luba. I realize I've been remiss. It was my job to show you how many people had taken the survey, but also where they were. What was very important to us when seeking the opinions of gender journalists was that we didn't just seek the opinions of gender journalists who live in Western Europe, like I do, or the US or the UK, but to have more of a global focus. And so we've had responses from 48 countries so far. I also would like more. If you are from a country that is not highlighted in red on this map, please fill out the survey. I want to now move to Ankita, who's got some more in-depth findings to share. When we conceived of this survey, we wanted to find out what are the challenges of doing this work, what are the benefits of doing this work, and how people define this work themselves. So, Ankita, could I ask you to share some of the main findings that we've had? And your job is to elbow me in the ribs when we need to change slides.
Okay. The first thing we did, we were very conscious of the adage that definitions have belonged historically to the definers, not the defined. So we were very particular about the fact that there should be maximum self-identification, self-definition. So we asked people what term they prefer, gender journalism or feminist journalism, and this is what we got. And the reasons, we also asked people to explain the reasons behind their choice. There were two kinds. One is, of course, personal, where someone feels like gender is more inclusive or feminist is more political, and that's what we need. But it was not just about personal preference, because they obviously are working in an ecosystem, and they were also thinking of how their audience, based on the socio-cultural context or the region, would respond or react. So the choice was also determined by, okay, we are going to go with a term that is not going to alienate our audience. So that was one. And then we also asked people how much of, like whether they wanted to do more or less. Do you have that?
But should we go into the definitions?
Okay, yeah, let's do that. Yeah. So gender is more friendly. It's something that does not, upset people, but Agustina was telling us today that where she is actually is the other way around, where feminist is supposed to be more gentle and gender is not. And why feminist? Because it's political, we are in, social inequality, and it's intersectional. So these are some of the reasons. Desire to do more. A lot of the people felt like what they're doing currently is enough, but most of these people are already devoting 75 to 100% of the time already doing gender journalism, which is why they felt like, they don't want to do anymore. I mean, this is really like taking the juice out of them, so they can't do anything.
We should all be doing 110% feminist journalism.
And the challenges, so burnout. 55% reporters, 29% editors, because they're a little more removed from the ground. Burnout was huge, and when I say burnout, it's not just exhaustion or trying to put in 110%, but also it includes moral injury, trauma, feeling isolated, depression, all of that. And then there were other challenges, which is, there was the question of language. Like the Gender Beat recently did a training with a group of Southeast Asian journalists, and at the end of the training, we said, okay, here is a list of resources you can consult, and there were, all sorts of manuals, guidelines. But most of them are in English. So you cannot just pick up these English terms and superimpose them on a local context without, understanding what's happening there locally. So that is a concern, and journalists have come back to us saying, okay, we know that we don't have the perfect term, but we also cannot just use what's there in English. And involving men is challenging.
Okay, I think it was reading through these, those burnout statistics, if I may, they're just completely unacceptable. We can't have a world where 55% of people who report on gender and feminism are burning themselves out. So I think, this really speaks to, despite this, everybody wants to do at least the same or more. So the desire is strong, but perhaps the support networks are not there. I want to turn to my colleague, Agustina. Agustina writes every month a wrap of everything that is making news in gender equality and feminist movements and LGBTQIA+ movements worldwide. And so I was really interested to get Agustina's perspective as someone who reads probably more gender news than any other human being on earth, about how, what are the impressions that you have about how the international media is covering gender day in, day out?
Hello there, thank you for being here. So I think to analyze how international media covers gender issues, we need to separate mainstream media or Western media and international news agencies on one hand, and on the other hand, we have those alternative community media outlets. I think new agencies and mainstream media in Western countries have succeeded in incorporating gender issues in their coverage. We can see them in breaking news, main news, and of course, the wonderful job that their correspondents do in different countries. And as I see in these countries, well, you have gender issues are in the in the public discussion, and there are several rights that have been won. And I think that the struggle is more concentrated nowadays in preventing the advance of the extreme right sectors on these rights. I also think that international news agency and mainstream media plays an important role in those countries where it's difficult to access information. In countries where women and gender diverse people and queer people don't have access to the media or don't have freedom of expression. I'm talking countries like Afghanistan, where women can't take a trip without a male tutor, or Iran, where they can't go out with their veil, or countries like Uganda, where you can't say you're part of the LGBT community without being maybe in jail. So I think that media, however, these media are not enough, because they normally cover what is on the public discussion or have an overall look on some issues that need deeper understanding. And we shouldn't forget either that they have a Western point of view, which is not the only one. So I think that when we want to talk about women and gender diverse people that aren't part of the agenda or don't succeed in reaching the media, or they want maybe to install their issues on the public discussion, we need to talk about alternative community media outlets in order to have a wider landscape on how media covers gender issues. I think this kind of media is essential in Latin America, I think also in Asia, where we have, they are democracies, but they have deep inequalities, and their society are more traditional and patriarchal, and so there's still a long way to go in terms of gender equality. So gender coverage in this media, in the mass media, is more reduced. So I think it's a strong work done by alternative community journalism. So to keep informed on gender issues worldwide, I read the breaking news on the news agencies, then I consult the mainstream media, and then I go straight to my timeline where I have several lists with journalists, activists, human rights organizations, and alternative media outlets from all over the world. I also subscribe to a lot of newsletters because, there are lots of newsletters based on gender as impact. So I think that's the best way to have a wider landscape on how media is gender issues worldwide.
Thank you so much. Before I go to my next question for you, Ankita, I remember, Luba, we discussed you actually have some insights about the burnout question, and I wanted to make sure that we didn't miss those on how intersecting identities can make burnout kind of even harder.
Yes, so we met over lunch, and I was really struck by these incredibly punishing statistics that you presented, majority of gender journalists being burned out. And it reminded me of the interviews that I conducted for the latest From Outrage to Opportunity, where I spoke to a number of editors from people of color, women of color, and people of color. And by that, I want to clarify that we are fully aware when we were writing the report that most people are of color in the world, but the way we used it in the report is to juxtapose white people and people of color in multiracial societies. So what struck me is that there was a real delineation between how harder women of color have it in journalism than white women. And in the course of the research, we found that the women of color suffer essentially quadruple bind. They, on the one hand, they experience gender bias, which is something that all women in journalism experience to some degree. Overlaid onto that is racial bias, and also on top of that, they're often asked to resolve the problem of their own underrepresentation by being thrusted in DEI initiatives. And finally, they're seen as the support pillar for everyone around them. And that leads to enormous amount of burnout, isolation, and there also statistics shows, especially from the States that we found, is that they're much more likely to leave journalism than other groups. So what I want to highlight is the importance of looking at the problem intersectionally. And to your point, just throwing manuals, unfortunately, isn't enough. There is need for support, for mentoring, for well-being and safety programs, for freelance journalists, but also for staff. And those at the moment are largely missing.
I mean, I feel like I can weigh in from the freelance perspective. I was a freelancer for 5 years before I started working with Impact. And I would report stories about, say, intimate partner violence or femicide, which goes in with that. And I would just sit down at my computer and go to write these stories, and I would just cry for an hour, and then I would be able to start writing. And I just wonder if, there is so much vicarious trauma that goes with reporting reporting issues relating to gender inequality, be it restrictions on people's personal freedoms, be it violence, be it harassment, and it's a toll that a lot of people are taking, and freelancers, I'm just so pleased you made that point, because freelancers are really often taking on those things alone, or hopefully they have a supportive editor, but that's the best they can get. So I think the need for community for people who are reporting these difficult issues is...
And if I may say one last thing, is there is a real need in change of culture from one where is, when I spoke with editors, especially from the Global North, but also Global South, they said, oh, we're taught just suck it up and keep going. So there is a culture of seeing emotions as the enemy and being repressed, which of course accelerates burnout.
Yes. And I think also for freelancers, the toll of pitching these stories is very hard because you care so much. And then when the pitch is being rejected by an editor because they have different priorities or because gender is not a priority, and you feel that you're carrying such important stories and you feel you're being told that, for example, a record number of women killed by their partners in a year is not important, or that those women are not important. So I think, Ankita, you mentioned moral injury. I think that really goes with it as well. I'm going to stop being so depressing because the other thing that we asked people about in our survey and another dimension that we really wanted to explore was the benefits of doing this work. If there weren't any benefits, we would not do it. So Ankita, what did you find when looking through these responses about why journalists and editors want to do this type of journalism, and where is that motivation to do more coming from?
The almost unanimous feeling was that the current coverage of gender journalism, the current state of gender journalism, current coverage of issues related is not adequate, and almost everyone agreed on it. So that itself becomes a motivation. And then there is what journalism is. I mean, if you are going to do journalism and follow the principles of journalism, which include being objective, unbiased, etc., you cannot just skip half the world and say, yeah, we are doing our job right. And then there is concern with the impact on society, that it is a public service and it's a sizable audience and we need to include their perspectives. I also want to add some quotes, Megan. More often than not, women are treated like second-class citizens. A tiny way of changing the status quo is to report on their lived experiences. So I think, with all the discussion on burnout, the fact that there's still faith amongst us that the work we do does create this impact. There was also a need expressed to counter the male gaze, to quote a respondent. In a sector dominated by male viewpoints and the male gaze, the other half of the population gets to have an equal say if we do feminist journalism.
Thank you so much. I was really struck in the responses by what a commitment to journalism as a public service there were amongst our respondents, and I think that's important. I think it's telling because this type of journalism is often seen as, oh, is it activism? Is it, a side issue? Whereas really our respondents saw it as fundamental to the functioning of a healthy society. I'm going to go back to you now, Agustina, and I'm so pleased you're with us because I think Latin America has had a really remarkable trajectory in terms of gender equality in recent years. And much as we've seen rollbacks of the rights of women and gender diverse people in places like the US, in Poland, for example, and in other parts of the world, in Latin America, we're really seeing a tide turning in the opposite direction. But we're also seeing, and I know that I take a lot of my cues as an editor from some of the remarkable feminist journalism as well that's happening in Latin America. So can you talk a little bit to how newsrooms have responded to this incredible moment?
Yes, well, in Latin America, feminist journalists themselves have been part of the movement that has driven gender changes in gender equalities legislation in recent years. This movement is Ni Una Menos. For those who are not familiar with Ni Una Menos, it's a movement that began in Argentina in 2015 against gender-based violence and on legal abortion also, that's why I have the green scarf. And that quickly spread to the entire continent. It was a journalist who put on Twitter after the femicide of a 14-year-old girl, aren't going to raise our voices, they are killing us. And if you open this tweet, you can see that the responses of more journalists, activists, and intellectuals who organized this mobilization. There's a phrase of Rebecca Solnit I really like. She said that Me Too didn't mean that women started to speak, but they started to be heard. And that is also what happened with us after Ni Una Menos. I was working at that moment at a very known newspaper in Buenos Aires. And just before Ni Una Menos, there was an article with the headline, The Man Who Killed for Love. And it was published in the trends section. And we were like very upset because of that, because media historically has reproduced violence against women and gender diverse people and queer people, but that doesn't mean that the journalists that work there shared that position. So we made a statement and the media was very angry with us. But after Ni Una Menos, they hired a gender editor, they started to have a gender section, and they give training to all the journalists. So I will say that the advance of feminism in Latin America has forced newsroom to change in order to be able to articulate the demands of the society. Because it's a society that started to criticize each time we see a photo of a presidential summit where it's all men, or when the victim of a femicide is blamed for her outfit. We started to criticize that, and we started to be heard. So several media started to incorporate the gender editor and the gender section, not without difficulty, because as you know, gender editors are one of the favorite targets of hate campaigns in social media, and they're also under pressure of their colleagues, because every time that the media reproduce violence, they are like, okay, they are not doing their job, and that's not true. And they're also under a lot of pressure because they have to dig in other sections, But not all media are changing, and that's why I think it's important, once again, to talk about alternative media outlets. Because in Latin America, you have a huge concentration of media in few hands, and of course, those hands are white men hands. So we shouldn't forget that Latin America is a region with very deep patriarchal roots. So, and not all people have access to the media. So I like to rephrase Bell Hooks when she said, like, we have a center of power, so we can say media are a center of power, but then in the margins you have another kind of feminist journalism that done by racialized, Black, indigenous, rural, immigrant, and disabled women, and gender diverse people. We have Volcánicas in Guatemala, Wambra in Ecuador, Asmin in Brazil, Agencia Presentes in Argentina. They sometimes do journalism without having the tools or the money, but they do it anyway in order to amplify the voices of the people they represent. And that's extremely valuable to have an intersectional and plural journalism in Latin America.
Can you tell us about the photo that we're looking at?
Yes, I'm part of a group that's Periodistas Feministas, and this picture was taken during several demonstrations we have for legal abortion in Argentina.
And I just love this picture because it's feminists and it's journalists, and there's two kids in a pram up the front. I think inclusion of people who have caring responsibilities is such an important part of doing any kind of feminist work. So thank you for sharing this picture, which I love, and I might get put on my wall. Luba, I now want to come to you again for a little bit more of a positive vibe, if you will. Luba's done some incredible work and some incredible workshops for the Gender Beat about how to make the case for gender coverage in the newsroom, because as we saw from our survey, there are a lot of people who are kind of doing this work alone or with no resources, who need kind of backup and who need to argue for that 2% of coverage to become 50% to represent the 50% of the world's population that we are. How do you advise newsrooms on making the case for more and better gender journalism?
Thank you, Megan. So just to clarify that the work that's been done in this area, I've done with a team of people, including Richard Addy, who is sitting in the room today, and without his insights, this wouldn't have happened. But just to go back to the last 20 years, the two main arguments that have been used to make coverage and journalism more equitable have been the rights-based, which you just illustrated. It's about there are 50% of the audiences are women, they need to be covered, and the second one is the journalism ethics argument around it's our duty to represent all audiences. Unfortunately, no discernible progress has been made in the last decades with this argument. So, in the latest report, well, we've actually talked about the different frames and narratives used in two of the reports. But in this latest one, we asked the editors that I interviewed to choose which arguments they thought would make strongest case for more equitable journalism. And what we found is that there are three frames. The journalistic duty is definitely the strongest still, but there are two others that are very, very important to highlight. The second being the audience relevance. So we need to make journalism that's relevant to our audience. And the third one is the revenue opportunity of producing more equitable journalism by bringing in audiences that feel disenfranchised otherwise. So essentially it sounds something like this: by fulfilling their duty to give equitable voice to women and minority groups and being relevant to all audiences, news organizations will increase their revenues and improve their volatile business models. So this is what gets editors very excited. And what was really interesting is that we measured how long they spoke about each argument, and we found that the business argument, when they were talking about this, they used between 3 to 4 times more words than they use for any other argument. So it really got them going. So I found that fascinating because it was a behavioral way of finding out really how much they care. So, and just finally, Richard, who is sitting here today, made this incredibly innovative, the first ever, he quantified the business opportunity for gender equity in journalism and found that for every percent of closing the gender gap, consumption gap between men and women, which is 20%, between 15 and 16% in favor of men for print and online. So for every percentage closed gap, you get 1% increase in revenues. And that's something that speaks to everybody in journalism, because we're all losing our jobs due to the shrinking industry.
Can gender journalism save us from AI? Or am I going to lose my job anyway?
That's another threat coming, that because AI is based on everything that's been said in the past, women are going to be shut out on a different level with that wave coming now.
So more and better gender journalism to stop us being taken over by the robots. Take that one away with you. I have one more quote that I want to share from the survey about why do gender journalism. It's up there. It speaks for itself. the untold is told, and that's really what journalism is for, isn't it? So that's something that I keep with me now all the time when I do the work that I do. I really want to open us up for questions, and I'm hoping that people have some to ask of our lovely panelists. Do we have a microphone going around? We do. Okay, it's going to go here first in the front row.
Hi, thanks. Is this on? Yeah. Thanks so much. That was really interesting. I definitely want to hear more about the survey results. And Megan, I'm really glad you mentioned Tarana Burke. I was one of the people that had put her on the cover of GT magazine when I was working at The Guardian and given her the credit when no one else was. But anyway, my name is Sabrina. I'm a data journalist working on digital human rights, but I'm also the co-founder of a arts activist collective called Feminist Internet. And between the kind of two of those worlds, have been trying to launch a number of investigative projects and stories around gender. It's not the only thing I cover, but there has been a real obvious difference between the projects that aren't about gender and the way that they get funded very easily and placed very easily, and the ones that haven't. And I just want to kind of ask whether that was a question that you put to the survey respondents, what kind of feedback you had, and also what kind of advice you have for kind of, you know, applying to grants when doing these kind of gender investigative projects.
Ankita not only has all the data, but is also like an absolute whiz at applying for grants, and is so I'm hoping she can have some info there.
There was this, so all the funders we surveyed agreed on the need for gender journalism. Nobody said that, yeah, it's important, but you know, we should put it after climate, etc. So that was unanimous. And a lot of these people were funding re-granters. So they are getting funds and then they are distributing either individually as fellowships or to organizations. And they said that it can be hard to convince the funders that this is a priority. They have their, you know, own list of what they want to focus on. So what happens is it doesn't get categorized as gender journalism. It could be development reporting, or it could be something else like trafficking, and then women come in. So stuff like that. But yeah, we didn't really have people who are funders for specifically gender journalism, definitely not feminist journalism.
I think we have another question here. I think you were next, and then we'll go there. Hello.
Thank you. Is this on? Okay. Hi. First of all, thank you so much for being on this panel and just sharing these results, which are some bleak, but also some hope in there. So yeah, thank you. I have a question around what you talked about trauma, because there were a few mentions, and it's just something I think about often in my work. But like, when is there too much trauma going around to justify cutting a story? So I think that often in this work, you know, you're talking to people who have experienced deep trauma on some level, whether it's to do with reproductive justice, or maybe it's people who are in quite precarious situations in their living conditions. I mean, so from like a feminist ethic point of view, you want to tell the story to make a change, but you also want to care for the people who are your sources. And it's like, do you continue digging into something where actually by telling that story, you might make a difference, but you might also really be unearthing this level of trauma for yourself and your sources that is hard to justify at the end of the day. Thank you.
Does anyone mind if I take this? Can I take this one? Okay. The story I mentioned where I would just sit down and cry, it still hasn't been published. And it hasn't been published because when we were at the final fact-checking stage with the publication, our main source said, I can't do it anymore. And it wasn't even a question about whether we would respect that. And so we lost the commission, and the source withdrew. And I would say that I was worried about saying to the editor, you know, we can't feature this person, the main character in this story anymore, because it's too hard for them to go through the fact-checking process. This person had a very good relationship with my co-reporter and felt very comfortable sharing with her, but couldn't face the idea of sharing their story again with a fact-checker. And so I was concerned about, I knew that there was only one thing we could do, but I was concerned about how the editor would respond, and the editor was amazing. And that really gave me a lot of hope. The editor didn't try and push us to push the source to delve more into their trauma. And I think from I don't know if anyone else has any other view, but from my point of view, that was the only thing that we could do, even if it meant losing the story.
Can I add something? So in the latest report, we have 9 case studies from trailblazing organizations around the world that are doing amazing work at any part of the value chain. One of them is Cabalaria in India. And what they were talking about, and I remember just being mesmerized by how amazing they are. So they're all-women newsroom in India. There is an Oscar-nominated documentary about them. You probably have heard or seen it. But what they were saying is that their relationship with sources is very, very different to the relationship of mainstream media. And I remember they used something like thereafter the headline bite, whereas Caballari is all about protecting the sources, but also protecting their journalists. So they would often go and after media have mainstream media have withdrawn and gone, and they would actually never break stories, but the stories they would tell are full of care, and they would always leave out details that they know will get them clicks, but that are unethical. So I was very inspired by them. So if anyone wants to read that case study, you could do so.
I think we have time for one more question, if that person could be quite quick. Yes, and it was here. I did promise you, didn't I? While the mic is going there, here's the QR code to take the survey. I'm about to put up another QR code, which will be for feedback for this session. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The Gender Beat is constantly kind of thinking about how we can best serve communities of gender journalists. So once this QR code goes away, scan the other one, and please fill out our feedback form. Okay, your question.
So it might be more a comment, but hopefully it might also give us thoughts of what we can do in the future altogether. So I'm Anissa, I'm the head of media programs at Spark News. We're not in media, but we help media talk about today's most pressing issues in a more constructive way. And I wanted to go back to Eliza's quote that you said at the beginning of 44%, was it, of people that are kind of fed up with gender. And kind of tying it to what Luba, you said about 2% coverage, and kind of saying that it's not just about how much gender gets covered, but also how it gets covered. So, I mean, in France, in very top media outlets, we see narratives that are super controversial. So you still get very, very large media outlets that do have enormous reach, talk about gender more and more, but still in a very controversial way. So I wonder if there are things that we should do in terms of training journalists, whether they're male or female, that are already on the job. I mean, I see a lot of people talking about gender and trying to kind of compare it with the work of climate journalists back in the days. But you have climate training nowadays, and you have experts going into newsrooms to get the training for those journalists. And maybe there's something that we should do for gender coverage in those big top newsrooms.
Agustina, could I ask you very quickly to respond to this one?
Well, yes, I think gender training is needed. Actually, I have a debate in Buenos Aires with several colleagues because a cis man started to write about gender in the media, and that's what you have people saying that, okay, I'm a gender expert and I'm not working on that, and this person does. And on the other hand, you have like, okay, we need that gender journalism is not only in the hands of gender journalists. I think that gender might have to cut across all the journalists. We need an editorial line to be based in gender-conscious perspective. And I think it's very important. We need that to take things to the next level, like we were talking about that with Megan before.
Thank you so much, Agustina. Thank you to the panel. I need to shout out the person who did the full survey analysis, someone we call Special Advisor Pitts, Marion Pitts, in Melbourne, Australia, who will not be watching this live because it's horrible o'clock there, but who will hopefully be seeing it on the replay. Thank you for that data work, Marion. And now could I just ask everyone here to thank our amazing panelists today, and thank you for coming. See you next time.
Sì, tutti fuori. Sorry. Graziano, mi puoi alzare? Prova.